The snow didn't fall softly that night. It fell like shrapnel slicing through the air, burying everything that still dared to move. The world had turned white, but there was nothing pure about it. Every breath felt like swallowing glass, every heartbeat a reminder that the cold could kill slower and quieter than bullets ever could. We were surrounded. No supplies, no reinforcements, no sky left to pray to. The forest around Bastogne had stopped being a battlefield. It had become a graveyard that hadn't finished its job yet. The Germans were somewhere in the trees, and the trees themselves groaned under the weight of ice and ghosts. We didn't talk much anymore. Words froze before they left our mouths. I remember looking at my hands, skin cracked, nails black, fingers stiff, like they belonged to someone already dead. I kept them wrapped around the rifle because I didn't trust them to remember what they were for. Somewhere out there, someone was probably writing that we were holding the line. But the truth was simpler. We were just holding on. That night, the snow didn't cover the world. It erased it. And the only thing left standing was the sound of men trying not to disappear with it. December 1944. The Ardennes Forest was supposed to be quiet, the kind of front where men could breathe between wars. But then the sky cracked open, and Germany came pouring through it one last time. They called it the Ardennes Offensive. We just called it hell frozen over. Bastogne was the heart of it, a small Belgian town surrounded by tanks, trapped under snow and fire. I was 19, a paratrooper from Ohio, trained to fall from the sky, not to dig into frozen mud. My rifle jammed twice that morning, and I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because nothing made sense anymore. I still had a letter from my mother folded in my pocket, the ink smeared by frost. She'd written, "You'll be home for Christmas." I read it every night, even when I stopped believing in Christmas. By then, we weren't fighting for ground. We were fighting for warmth, for one more breath that didn't freeze before it left our lungs. The snow muffled everything. Explosions, screams, prayers. You could die here, and the world wouldn't even hear it. If this voice reached you, don't let it fade. Subscribe to War Letters Stories, and tell me where you're listening from. Because remembrance, like fire, only survives if it's shared. The first thing the cold took was sound. You could scream, and the wind would swallow it whole. Even the guns seemed quieter, their echoes dulled by the snow. Every step sank into white powder that looked soft, but cut through the boots like knives. By the second day of the siege, my feet had stopped bleeding. Not because they healed, but because the blood had frozen. We were ghosts pretending to be soldiers. Wrapped in blankets, coated in frost, we dug foxholes with shovels that snapped against the iron ground. The earth was so hard that even the dead resisted being buried. Some of the men stopped talking altogether. Others couldn't stop, their voices trembling like the air around them. I kept counting breaths just to remind myself I was still alive. 1, 2, 3. As if numbers could keep death on a schedule. The forest didn't move, but it watched. Every branch was a rifle barrel, every shadow a possible end. We couldn't light fires. Smoke would give us away. So we huddled in the dark, sharing cigarettes that burned slower than our fear. The only warmth came from the barrel of a gun pressed against your chest, not because it was alive, but because it wasn't. The rations ran out before the week did. We tore open frozen cans with knives, sometimes just scraping the ice for a taste of salt. Someone joked that if we ever made it home, we'd never complain about cold soup again. No one laughed. Hunger wasn't pain anymore. It was a feeling of emptiness that had learned how to breathe. At night, the artillery started again. The shells didn't fall on schedule. They came in bursts, like the sky was coughing up its anger. You could feel the ground tremble, the snow slide off trees, and the foxholes shudder like coffins being nailed shut. We stopped ducking after a while. You can only flinch so many times before exhaustion wins. I remember one man, Harris. He kept a picture of his wife inside his helmet. Every time the shelling started, he'd touch it with his fingertips, whispering something I couldn't hear. One morning, he didn't move. His lips were blue, his eyes half open, the photo still in his hand. Frost covered them both, like the world had decided to preserve his last prayer. We didn't bury him. We just closed his eyes and sat with him until dawn. There's a kind of silence only soldiers know. not the absence of sound, but the refusal of it. It's the moment after the last explosion, when you realize you're still breathing and you almost feel guilty for it. That was Bastogne, a place where men learned that surviving could feel like stealing. Sometimes when the wind shifted, you could hear voices, not from our lines, but theirs. Germans shouting orders, laughing, clanking their metal cups. They had fire, food, blankets. They were warm. We were statistics waiting to be confirmed. I wondered if any of them were 19 too, if any of them had mothers writing letters that froze before they arrived. The days blurred together until time itself stopped keeping track. The world was a white wound, and we were trapped inside it. My watch had frozen at 3:17. I kept wearing it anyway, not to know the time, but to remember there had been a time. On the 7th day, the horizon changed color. At first I thought it was dawn, but it wasn't light. It was smoke. The Germans were preparing another assault. The waiting was over, and as I reached for my rifle with hands that no longer felt like mine, I realized the cold hadn't taken everything yet. It had left me fear, sharp, alive, and unwilling to die quietly. The sky had been gray for so long that we started to think maybe God had frozen too. Every morning we'd look up, hoping to see a plane, a parachute, a sign that someone remembered we were still down here. But all we saw was that same lid of clouds pressing down on the world, heavy and merciless. Bastogne had become a snow-covered coffin, and the sky was the lid keeping it shut. By the second week, hunger wasn't just a problem, it was an identity. You stopped being a soldier. You became a stomach with a rifle. The last of the rations were gone, and we'd started boiling snow in empty shell casings just to drink something warm. A few guys chewed on leather straps, swore it helped. I tried it once. It didn't. The Germans knew we were starving. They'd send leaflets over the lines, fluttering like dead birds, saying, "Surrender, Americans." Bastogne is finished. I used one to light a cigarette. The paper burned fast, but for those 2 seconds the fire felt like life. The irony didn't escape me. We'd risk our lives for warmth that didn't last long enough to melt the frost on our gloves. Frostbite had become our quietest enemy. Toes, fingers, noses. Small parts of us were disappearing every day. One morning a guy named Miller lost 3 fingers trying to reload his rifle. He didn't scream. He just looked at them, the way a man looks at coins he's dropped down a drain, gone forever, and no one's fault but gravity's. We talked less. When we did, it wasn't about the war. It was about warmth, about the last cup of coffee we'd had before coming here, about the way home smelled after rain, about nothing that could help us survive, but everything that made surviving worth trying for. The stories were our fire, invisible, but real enough to keep us from turning to stone. At night the shells still came, but they sounded slower, like even the Germans were tired. The explosions bloomed in the distance, orange and ghostly, painting the snow in brief, violent beauty. I'd look at them and think of fireworks on the 4th of July, the kind I used to watch lying in the grass with my brother. Then I'd remember where I was, and the thought felt like a sin. The worst part wasn't the hunger or the cold. It was the waiting, the kind of waiting that breaks something inside you. We'd sit in our holes listening for footsteps that never came, staring at the tree line until the trees started to move in our minds. When a branch cracked in the distance, you didn't know if it was the enemy or the forest dying slower than we were. One night, a man started praying out loud. He wasn't a preacher, just a kid from Chicago who said he'd never believed in anything before. His words were shaky, like the air itself was shivering. "If you're out there," he whispered, "maybe just open the sky." No one laughed, not because we believed, but because we understood. The next morning we woke to the same grey dome, the same silence. The prayer hadn't worked. Or maybe it had, and the answer was no. I remember thinking that faith is like warmth. It fades if you don't share it. So I said nothing. I just looked at the clouds and imagined what sunlight used to feel like. By that night, the temperature had dropped below 20 below zero. My breath froze in the air like smoke. I could see my reflection in the ice forming on my rifle barrel, eyes hollow, cheeks cracked. I didn't recognize the face anymore, and for the first time I wondered if the sky wasn't refusing to open. but protecting whatever was left of heaven from seeing us like this. You start to learn faces differently in war, not through names, but through what they endure. Frostbite, fear, hunger, they leave marks deeper than any bullet. After a while you can tell who's close to breaking by the way they stare at the horizon, like they're looking for an exit no one else can see. My foxhole was next to Andrew's. He was from Tennessee, a farmer's son who could tell you what kind of tree you were leaning on just by the smell of its bark. He had a smile that didn't belong in war, and he guarded it like ammunition. Some nights when the shelling stopped long enough for silence to breathe, we'd share the last cigarette of the day, passing it back and forth until it burned our fingertips. We called it church. He had a small harmonica he kept wrapped in cloth. Said his father gave it to him when he was 12. One night he played a few notes, soft and low, just enough to remind us what peace might have sounded like once. The melody was crooked, cracked by cold air, but for a minute it worked. The world stopped shivering. Even the wind seemed to listen. We didn't talk about dying anymore. We talked about home, not as a place, but as an idea. Andrews told me about his mother's kitchen, how she used to hum while stirring soup. I told him about my brother, how we'd race our bikes until the streetlights came on. It was strange. Those conversations felt more real than the snow under our hands. War makes you cling to ghosts like they're blankets. One night he handed me half of his last chocolate bar. "You're gonna need this more than I do," he said. I laughed, told him he was crazy. "Maybe," he answered, "but if I don't make it, I don't want the bastards saying I died selfish." He smiled that Tennessee smile again, the kind that didn't know how to quit. The next morning, the Germans shelled us harder than ever. The snow exploded around us, trees split in half, the air filled with dirt and smoke that smelled like iron. I lost sight of Andrews for maybe 30 seconds, long enough for the world to change. When I found him, he was lying face up in the snow, eyes open, lips still curved in that half smile. The harmonica was in his hand. I knelt beside him, shaking, not from cold, but from the silence that followed. I didn't cry. Couldn't. The tears froze before they could fall. I just sat there, staring at the small dent the harmonica had left in his glove. I remember thinking how unfair it was, that something so full of music could be the last thing he ever held. I buried him myself. No cross, no marker, just a helmet turned upside down and his harmonica beneath it. The snow began to fall again while I was covering the grave, light flakes landing on my hands like dust. I whispered something, but I don't remember what. Maybe his name. Maybe a lie that he was going home. That night, I took the last cigarette we'd shared and broke it in half. I smoked one piece and left the other beside the helmet. When the smoke hit the back of my throat, it burned like confession. I realized then that survival wasn't about luck. It was about inheritance. Every breath you take after someone else's last one belongs to them. When I crawled back to the foxhole, I looked up at the sky again. Still closed, still grey. But for a second I imagined I could hear something, faint, far away, like a single note from a harmonica carried by the wind. Maybe it was memory. Maybe mercy. Either way, I let it play. The snow had started to fall heavier again, the kind that hides more than it covers. Every sound became suspect. The snap of a twig, the whisper of wind through frozen branches, even your own heartbeat. The forest was alive, but not in the way it should have been. It breathed like an animal, slow and patient, waiting for movement. Somewhere out there, the enemy was doing the same. We'd been told the Germans were closing in. They were moving through the woods at night, camouflaged in white, ghosts with rifles. You didn't see them until they were already behind you. That night, I was on watch with 2 others, crouched in the dark, fingers on triggers so cold they felt like glass. We didn't talk. Talking got men killed. Then we heard it, soft crunching in the snow, maybe 20 yards ahead. One of the guys next to me lifted his rifle. I held my breath. A shadow moved between the trees, tall, careful, deliberate. Not a deer, not wind. I felt the muscles in my arm tighten, the finger begin to pull. But then I saw something that stopped me. The shadow was shivering. He stepped into a sliver of moonlight, a German soldier, maybe 18, maybe younger. His face was pale, almost blue. He was holding his rifle but not aiming it, just clutching it like a child holds a toy for comfort. For a moment we stared at each other through the storm, two boys dressed in different colors pretending to be men. I don't remember deciding to lower my weapon. I just did. Maybe because he looked scared, maybe because I was too. But one of the others fired. The shot cracked like lightning, echoing through the forest. The boy dropped instantly, falling backward into the snow with a sound softer than the shot that killed him. The silence that followed felt wrong, like the world had forgotten what it was supposed to do next. We waited, expecting a counterattack, expecting the woods to come alive with gunfire. Nothing. Just snow, falling thicker now, burying him faster than we could think. I crawled toward him before the others could stop me. His eyes were open, staring at the gray sky. I reached out and closed them with my glove. He was still warm. That detail broke something in me. In his coat pocket, I found a photograph, a woman and a baby. She was smiling, holding the child close. On the back, a few words written in German, but I didn't need to translate them. The handwriting said everything. He wasn't a monster. He was someone's hope, someone's promise that never made it home. When I returned to the foxhole, no one spoke. One of the guys muttered, "Should have stayed out there. He was the enemy." I didn't answer. I just looked down at my hands, still trembling, the photograph hidden inside my jacket. The longer I stared at them, the less they felt like mine. That night, I dreamed of him. Not as a soldier, but as a mirror. I saw us both standing there, snow falling between us, both holding rifles we didn't want to use. When I woke, my hands were clenched around nothing, but my chest felt heavy like the air itself had turned to lead. By morning, his tracks were gone. The snow had erased him completely, as if he'd never existed. But I still saw him every time the wind blew through the trees. His face, his eyes, that tiny photo. It was like the forest had absorbed him, made him part of itself. That was the moment I understood something the cold hadn't managed to kill. Empathy. It was a dangerous thing to carry in a place like Bastogne. But once you see your enemy's humanity, you can never put that vision back in the dark. You can still shoot, still fight, still survive. But you never forget that somewhere out there, someone is doing the same. For the same reasons and with the same fear. The snow had started to melt just enough to reveal what it had been hiding. Helmets, rifles, faces. The white quiet was turning back into color, dull, gray, human. The siege had lasted so long that the concept of time had lost its shape. We didn't know what day it was anymore, only how many nights we'd made it through. Some of the men had started writing letters again, even though there was nowhere to send them. I decided to write one too. I borrowed a scrap of paper from the medic's pack, the back of a casualty report, and a stub of pencil barely the size of a bullet. I stared at the blank side for hours before the words finally came. "Dear Mrs. Andrews," I began. It felt strange to write her name, like I was trespassing on a piece of peace that didn't belong to me. I told her that her son was brave, that he died quick, that he wasn't afraid. None of it was true, but truth didn't belong in letters like this. Hope did. I wrote about the harmonica, about how he played it one night and the whole forest seemed to listen. I told her he smiled until the end, even when the snow fell on his face. I didn't tell her that his hands were still warm when I buried him. Some truths are too cruel to send through paper. Some are meant to stay frozen with the dead. When I finished, I signed it without thinking. Sincerely, his brother in arms. It was the closest thing to family we had left. I folded the letter carefully, placed it inside an envelope made from cigarette paper, and tucked it into my pocket, next to the photo of the German soldier's wife and child. Two worlds that would never know they shared a grave in my jacket. The next morning, I watched the medic collect the letters from the others, hundreds of small white papers sealed with frozen breath. He said, "When this is over, I'll deliver them all." We nodded, pretending to believe him. He didn't make it through the week. The letters froze in his bag, stiff as the men who wrote them. Days later, I found myself reading the one I'd written again and again, as if saying the words out loud could make them real. I imagined Mrs. Andrews opening it, her hands shaking, eyes wet, smiling through tears because her boy had been brave. I wanted to give her that comfort, even if I never believed it myself. That night, the shelling started again, heavier, closer. The sky turned orange, the snow glowing like fire from below. The letter slipped out of my pocket as I dove for cover. When the world stopped shaking, I crawled out of the hole and saw it lying in the snow, burning slowly, edges curling in the wind. For a second, I thought about saving it, but then I didn't. Some things are better left unsent. I watched it burn until it was nothing but ash, the words lifting into the night sky, carried by the same wind that froze our breath and our prayers. Maybe she'd never know what I'd written, but maybe that was mercy too. The war had a way of taking everything honest and turning it into survival. That night I dreamed of Andrews again. He was sitting on the edge of his foxhole, harmonica in hand, playing the same cracked tune. I sat beside him, and we didn't speak. When I woke, I realized my hands were gripping the photo of the German soldier's family. The paper was damp with sweat. I stared at it for a long time before whispering, "I'm sorry." I didn't know who I was talking to anymore. By dawn, the snow had stopped falling. Smoke curled low across the forest. Somewhere beyond those trees, the sound of engines, American tanks. The siege was breaking, but before I dared to stand, I reached into my pocket and pressed the ashes of the letter against my heart. Not for luck, for memory. Because even things that never reach their destination still deserve to be remembered. That night, the wind changed. It carried a new sound, deep, distant, almost gentle, like thunder rolling under the earth. Someone whispered, "Tanks." For a second, no one believed it. Hope was a language we'd forgotten how to speak, but the sound grew louder, steadier. We looked at each other, not daring to say it out loud. Could it be them? Could it really be us? Then the shelling began again. Not theirs, ours. The sky above Bastogne lit up like a dying sun. Artillery thundered from beyond the tree line, our artillery breaking through the enemy's wall of ice and silence. The snow no longer fell, it exploded. The white world turned red and gold, as if the heavens themselves had remembered we were still here. The ground shook so violently that the foxholes collapsed. Men laughed, cried, screamed all at once. It was chaos, but it was our chaos again. Ellis grabbed my shoulder and shouted over the noise, "They're here, the 4th Armoured's coming through." His voice cracked, half joy, half disbelief. I'd never seen him cry before. He didn't even notice the blood on his temple. He just kept shouting, as if saying it enough times would make the world real again. And for the first time in weeks, I let myself believe him. The Germans fought hard. They always did. You could hear their shells whistling through the sky, desperate, angry, losing. The forest was on fire. Trees fell, roots tearing from the frozen ground like bones from flesh. I remember the taste of ash, the sting of smoke, the heat of the air after weeks of nothing but cold. It was unbearable, beautiful, human. The kind of heat that reminded you were alive. When it was over, the night didn't end, but it just went quiet again. A different kind of quiet this time. Not fear, not waiting, just stillness. The snow had stopped burning and started falling softly again, covering the black scars left behind. I looked around, men standing, kneeling, some praying, some just staring. We were all still there, but none of us were the same. I found Ellis sitting near the edge of the woods, hands shaking, staring into nothing. "You made it," I said. He smiled faintly, eyes unfocused. "Yeah, I made it." Then he coughed, and blood touched his lip. I reached for him, but he waved me off. "Hey, it's all right," he whispered. "It's over." He handed me the cigarette case, and the same one he'd carried since Omaha, and pressed it into my hand. "Keep it," he said. "Something to remember the noise by." His fingers went still before I could answer. I sat there for what felt like hours, the snow slowly burying him, his face peaceful in a way that life never allowed. I didn't have tears left, only breath, small, frozen, borrowed. I opened the case. Inside was a single cigarette, unlit, untouched. I took it out, placed it on his chest, and closed the lid. "Rest now," I whispered. the night's over. By morning, the tanks had rolled in. The siege of Bastogne was broken. The men cheered, but their voices sounded strange, distant, hollow. We'd won, they said. But when I looked around, I couldn't see victory anywhere. Just snow, blood, and the empty shapes where laughter used to live. Later, as I walked through the forest, I saw the first light of dawn breaking through the trees. It wasn't warm, but it was real. I stopped and watched it rise over the white horizon. I thought of Andrews, of Ellis, of the German boy, of the letter that never reached home. They were all somewhere in that light now, silent but not gone. They called it the Battle of the Bulge. History would say it was a triumph of courage, a turning point in the war. But for those of us who lived it, it was something else entirely. It was the longest night, the night when death waited patiently, and somehow we asked it to wait one more day. And it did. They said the snow in Bastogne turned red only once, on the night the world remembered us. But for those who survived, it was never red. It was grey, the colour of ash, of silence, of things that should have ended but didn't. We came here as soldiers, but left as witnesses, the kind that never stop hearing the echoes, the harmonica in the dark, the laughter that froze mid-breath, the whisper of a letter burning quietly in the snow. History will call it victory. But to us, it was a negotiation, between life and the cold, between faith and the void, between the man you were and the one who came back. Some nights, when the wind blows through the trees, I swear I can still hear them, the voices of those who didn't see the dawn. They don't ask for glory, only to be remembered, because that's the truth of Bastogne. The war didn't end when the guns went quiet. It ended when the last survivor finally learned how to sleep again.